Good afternoon. Thank you for attending this webinar on cybersecurity regulations for IoT devices in the UK and Europe. But before we begin, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Joe Lamarco. I'm the Business Development Manager for Wireless and IoT Products at TUV-SUD. And my primary role is helping manufacturers of wireless and IoT products navigate the compliance requirements in getting a product to market and the global market, which of course includes cybersecurity. I'd also like to introduce my colleague, Jordan Melbourne, who is our cybersecurity specialist and technical lead in our UK cybersecurity test lab. So this webinar is designed to give an overview of the present and imminent regulatory requirements for cybersecurity consumer IoT devices in UK and Europe. In this webinar, we'll present a basic overview of what the IoT is and how it's constructed, a brief overview or review of the legislative framework that's being developed and the associated standards, and then we'll conclude with a short example from Jordan on how our technical team will perform an assessment. But before we can continue, let me just ask a quick question. Ask a quick question. What is a consumer smart product? So in this slide, you'll see a number of examples, many of which you may already possess yourself. It can vary from smartwatches to fitness devices to smart home appliances, home automation, lighting and security. And I think most people will recognize a lot of these devices, but what they all have in common is that they are in some way connected to the internet. So let's have a look at how that is. So this slide shows a very basic layout of a typical IoT architecture based around consumer products. Most consumers are totally unaware of how their IoT devices work and what's behind the scenes, but simplistically, they're basically just collecting data and transmitting through the internet. So in this picture, you can see a lot of devices that we've already looked at in the previous slide, such as the smart TV, smart fridge, smart home devices. We've also got smart home automation devices. And you'll probably see that they are connected with some kind of hub or gateway that manages these smart home devices. And they're probably connected to the internet via some kind of home router. And that is the typical scenario that you would probably recognize at home. But not all devices connect via a home router. Some may connect via other transports. So in this example, we have an external weather center that people might have at home, which is connected to the internet via cellular transport, and in this case, GSM. But there are other transports such as narrowband IoT, 4G, LTE, and some other long-range technologies, which we won't go into here. But what we can actually see here is that there are lots of areas and potential openings and vulnerabilities for a hacker to attack this infrastructure. And that's why it's important to make sure that some kind of standardized protection is put in place. So let's look at a few high-profile vulnerabilities that have hit the headlines in the past. I won't go over them all here, but you'll see these in the slides when we send them to you. But let's just point out a few. There was the famous baby cam incident, where a hacker was able to speak to the baby and the nanny in a private residence, obviously causing some considerable distress. There was the target data breach. Attackers got in via a vulnerability in the HVAC system and stole customers' data and credit details. And of course, the famous insecure Bluetooth My Kayla doll, where anybody in the range could connect via the insecure Bluetooth. This was in fact so serious that the German government actually classed it as an espionage device. So as you can see, what may seem like an innocuous vulnerability could have quite serious consequences. And since this webinar is UK and Europe based, let's just have a quick look at an example of something that's closer to home. This was this UK camera breach where an elderly couple had several cameras in their home as protection, and over a 3-year period, their cameras were viewed over 5,000 times in 70 different countries for a total of 366 hours, with the longest viewing being in France, which lasted for 9 hours. So as you can imagine, this couple were very, very concerned and I guess scared about what they saw. So who's actually doing this hacking? So there are a number of hackers or actors, as they might be called, good actors, bad actors. And the level of hacking, or what they're actually doing, depends on a combination of skills, maliciousness, occurrence, and what they're trying to do. So you have here on this particular diagram the so-called script kiddies, who don't have really a great level of skill and probably use free downloads of hacking tools and are probably doing this out of boredom or just seeing what they can do. Another example is the hacktivist, who might be a bit more skilled and have greater tools, or a greater level of skilled tools to use. Their level of maliciousness increases as they are trying to hack for some kind of political cause. You have what we might call the white hat hacker, or an hack who hack for research. They're highly skilled, malicious intent is very low. And they basically hack just to try and find how things work and how to make things better, and possibly even provide more sort of stronger protection tools. The other end of the scale, we have the highly skilled hackers that are high on maliciousness intent, who you could call cyber terrorists or black hat hackers even, who might be doing this for financial gain and just to basically steal your data, steal your money. So that gives a good overview of the level of hackers and their skills and maliciousness. So that was a very quick overview of what the threats are and who are the likely perpetrators. So we'll now go on and talk about the present legislation. So Europe. So there's quite a few things going on in Europe. And it's probably worthwhile talking about the EU Cybersecurity Act. And we'll just briefly go over this, and that's why I've titled this slide At a Glance. So the Cybersecurity Act came in on, or was voted in on the 12th of March 2019. It came into force on the 27th of June 2019. It will apply in full from the 27th of June 2021. And it's quite a big document, but there are two key areas of focus. It strengthens the power of ENISA, who is the EU Cybersecurity Agency, and it also establishes an EU Cybersecurity Certification Framework. But what does this actually mean? Well, essentially, it means it strengthens the mandate of ENISA. And as I say, this is the EU Cybersecurity Agency. And their role is to define policy or contribute to policy, increase and enhance trustworthiness of products within Europe, provide interoperational cooperation between member states, and basically promote knowledge and knowledge transfer. And the cybersecurity framework is basically establishing the cybersecurity framework for any future cybersecurity scheme that might be developed. Presently, we don't really know where this is going. Although it's probably forward thinking, there could be multiple schemes, but the Commission will actually assess whether mandatory certification is required, and that is something that we'll probably see in the near future. But from a UK consideration, how is an IoT device demonstrated to be compliant? Well, from a European perspective, it is very likely that cybersecurity of IoT devices will become part of the Radio Equipment Directive, or the RED as we know. An impact assessment was actually carried out on the increased protection of internet-connected radio equipment and wearable radio equipment. And basically what that impact assessment did was identify the different policy options that could be put forward to support regulation for manufacturers of IoT devices and how they might demonstrate compliance with their products. I'm not going into great detail about each of these policy options, but they're on here for your information, and you'll see these in the slides. But what I will report here is that there were a number of recommendations, 11 I think in total, but the main recommendation that came out of it was that the preferred policy option 4 would be used, and that would be to activate both delegated acts. And if you aren't familiar what those delegated acts are, 3.3e was the radio equipment incorporates safeguards to ensure the personal data and privacy of the use of the subscriber are protected. And 3.3f, which is radio equipment supports certain features ensuring protection from fraud. So what does this actually mean if this delegated act is activated? So if successful, a formal request from the Commission will be made requesting standards be developed and adopted into national regulations. The intention would be to eventually harmonise these standards and cite them in the official journal of the European Community. But this very much depends on the working in the delegated act. And that is something that we will see in the near future, depending on what action is taken on these recommendations. It's probably worthwhile pointing out that other delegated acts are also being considered in addition to 3.3e and f, and that is 3.3i and Article 4. And basically what this really means is that the considerations on software that can be uploaded to IoT devices or radio connected IoT devices is being considered, because there could potentially be future vulnerabilities on this type of software. So although I say that the Commission will call for standards to be developed, we may be pleased to know that standards are actually already being developed in parallel to the delegated act or the recommendations being discussed in the European Commission. And that standard is final draft EN 303-645, which has been developed by ETSI. And this is based on the UK Code of Practice, which we'll come and talk about very shortly. This document essentially identifies 13 security provisions, and each of these provisions have a set of subset provisions which could be mandatory and recommended. But it should be noted here that on note 4.1 within 303-645, if a manufacturer or their representative decides not to perform any assessment of the recommended provisions, then they do need to provide some kind of justification as to why that's not being done. There's also another document, namely TS 103-701, which is being developed in progress, in parallel or to support 303-645. And this is a document which includes the test methodology. And as I say, this is in progress as we speak, and we will probably see some final presentation of that in the next, well, several months. But because all this work is going on, developing standards, and discussions going on in the European Union, it's probably important to point out that this could be subject to change and that nothing is absolute presently. I want to speak about the UK in a moment. You probably I will point out that the UK is likely to adopt EN 303-645 in the future. That was a quick review of what's going on in Europe, but now we'll move on to the UK. So I mentioned earlier that the UK published a document called the Code of Practice. This was a document that was produced after a consultation on regulatory proposals for consumer IoT security. It's based around the principles of security by design. And from that came the 13 provisions which we saw in the 303-645 document that I mentioned a minute ago. So from that came a policy paper that was published on the 16th of July, 2020, which was basically calling for views on what the different policy requirements would be in the UK. And I'm going to go over now this proposed approach on this call for views. So probably worth noting that this policy paper that came out in the UK is only indicative and has not yet been finalised. So from this call for views, we will get feedback, and later on this year, we will have a better understanding of what the proposed legislation is going to be in the UK. But I will go over the main points on this call for views so you can get a better understanding of where the regulation is heading. So the scope of regulation, as you can see here, is just fixed to consumer devices. So the products intended to be in scope are things like connected children's toys, smart home devices, smart cameras, TVs, laptops, PCs. So I think you get the general idea of what a smart product is going to be covered under the UK consumer regulatory requirements. It's worthwhile pointing out here that a number of products are not going to be in scope, such as smart metering devices, because they have their own commercial product assurance. Things like automotive and electric vehicles will not be included, and industrial smart products, they have their own regulatory requirements. So that pretty much covers the scope of the product, but now we'll move on to what the actual proposed security requirements are. And as I, again, want to reiterate, this document is a call for views, and nothing is set in stone. So these requirements are, as I say, proposed. So there's set to be 3 requirements to start with in the UK. The first one is to ban universal default passwords in consumer smart products. The second is to implement a means to manage reports of any vulnerabilities that are found. And the third one is to provide transparency for how long a product will receive security updates, because that's going to be very important, because that will have a bearing on how a customer would buy a product. If it's going to, we want to make sure that it's basically going to be updated and secure for the lifetime of that product. So these are the 3 main requirements, as I mentioned, but it's probably worthwhile pointing out that the government may, at a later date, add additional security requirements to these 3. So we know what the scope of the products are. They're going to be covered by the legislation. We have now just defined what the requirements are, but who, or should I say, what are the obligations on the people that are producing product and putting them on the market? Now, these obligations depend on who the economic operator is that's putting these products on the market. So you have what we call the producer. This could be the manufacturer or the manufacturer's representative in the UK. You can have the obligation of a distributor. That's the person that's basically in the supply chain, other than the manufacturer. It could be, again, an authorized representative or an importer, or basically the person who makes the product available on the market. And then there's the online actors. A lot of consumer devices are purchased online from third countries, so the proposed legislation will look to address those, defining who these actors are and placing the responsibilities on them as appropriate. So how would these obligations be enforced? Well, it's probably, before we go into that, it's probably worthwhile taking a quick look at when these requirements are going to be enforced. Because even though we have 3, they are not all going to be coming in at the same time. So basically, following royal assent, or when it's actually put into UK law, each of the requirements will be introduced at different stages. So within 3 months of royal assent, requirement 2, which is implementing a means to manage reports of vulnerabilities, will come in. Then it'll be requirement 3 after 6 months, which is the security updates and software updates. And then after 9 months, we have the banning of universal default passwords in the consumer products. So what is the proposed enforcement approach? It's likely to be complaint driven. So this would be if a device is found to be non-compliant, It could be an academic institution. It could be potentially trading standards, and different people that would be affected by the product. There would be an enforcement body that would be established to enforce any enforcement that needed to be done. And any non-compliance would basically be brought to the attention of the manufacturer, and they would be given a chance effectively to rectify any problem or any non-compliance. But if that is not done, then the enforcement body may take appropriate actions and corrective measures, and that could be potentially prosecution and fines. What that might be at the moment is not fully understood or agreed, but when we look at other types of regulation, it could be up to 4% of the company's annual turnover. So that could be quite substantial. So in summary, the UK regulations, we've got 3 main security provisions through 303645. The call for views is now closed, but you can still go and view the information therein, and I would suggest that you do that because there's quite a lot of information in there, and I think you'll probably find it valuable. But as I say, the approach is still to be finalised. It's going to be going later this year, so we'll be looking out for what that's going to be. So now, I'll pass you on to my colleague, Jordan Melbourne, who's going to give you a quick overview of how we would demonstrate compliance with the standards. So it will take a walkthrough of a typical example. And Jordan, if I could pass on to you, I'll put the slides up for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. So before we start a test, gathering information is absolutely key. This will stop any delays or any issues being found. So we gather information in 2 different ways, through an ICS, and that's a report of all the provisions that need assessing based on your device's functions, and a self-declaration, which is more detailed explanation on your device's individual functions and how they work. To comply with provision 4.1, a justification must be provided if you are going to do the recommended provisions, as Joe mentioned before. So before we execute a test, we ask for certain documentation. This includes, as you can see, a user manual, a privacy policy, a vulnerability disclosure policy, and usually a firmware file for analysis. We will review all of this, make sure it's up to standard. We also ask that you have a point of contact. Whoever knows the most about your device, probably the same person who fills in the documents for us, in case we have any questions that may arise during the assessment. Obviously, for information we gather pre-test, there will be less input from you, and it'll be more of an efficient process as it is. Security passwords is the demonstration I'm going to take you through. This is because it is definitely the most commonly found vulnerability, and in my experience, one of the easiest to exploit. It's also the first requirement in UK regulations and also in the EN 303645. So what we do in this assessment is we review the password generation mechanisms outlined in the self-declaration to make sure they're sufficiently random. We'd ensure there is a minimum password complexity and length to help avoid brute force attacks and exploits by hackers. If default passwords are used, we would check that the user has the ability to set a new password and ensure the new password is needed for mechanisms which require authentication. We'd check the security of the password authentication method. It has protection from brute abuse, such as brute force protection, so the hackers can't run password guessing attacks on your system. And we'd check the password is securely stored, either encrypted or hashed in sufficient manner and not stored in plain text. So we can offer you an attestation of conformity, an AOC, which is an endorsement of the validity of our results that we found. We can also offer gap and risk analysis, which is what may need to be done to ensure testing runs smoothly. You'll also be provided with a report with all our findings and any recommendations we have.
Okay, thank you for that, Jordan.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's it from me. Yeah, thank you, Joe. Back to you.
Okay. So I'll just summarise the presentation we've done so far. I hope you found that valuable. But basically, in summary, cyber attacks are certainly on the increase. We know that. Standards are available for the Europe and the UK, although they might not be finalised and mandated yet. We still have a vehicle to provide some kind of protection validation. So even though the regulations are not yet finalised, we can perform assessments now. So you can now work to assess the state of your cybersecurity resilience on your product. But early engagement and preparation is absolutely key to smooth execution. But what I'd also like to say, even though certainly the European regulations might be 12, 24 months away, the UK regulations 3+ months away, early engagement is absolutely key so you can get a good understanding of what you need to provide to assist in the assessment of your product. So I hope you enjoyed that for UK and Europe. What I'd also like to remind people of is that part 2 of our webinar on global regulations will be conducted on the 14th of October at the same time. So I will now thank you for your time. And if you have any questions or require further information, please give me a call or a email on this following address and telephone number. Okay, thank you.